Now that we have fully detailed the lips and the eyelids, the first layer of skin stamps that we laid down feels incomplete by comparison. So in this lesson, I want to upgrade our generic skin universally across the sculpture to be more realistic. And you'll have to be patient as this effect comes into fruition because it's extremely subtle. It's less something that you can point to specifically in the reference and say, we're going to recreate exactly this. And it's honestly more of a feeling. How does the surface feel? Because right now it doesn't feel overly soft. It feels a little more, I don't know, like porcelain or kind of a hard surface with skin detail stamped onto it. However, if we look in the reference, this face has a tissue-like softness about it. Compared to this lady over here who's wearing makeup, this skin does not feel quite so soft. And I think that's partially the purpose of makeup. It's got more of a sheen to it. And granted, some people probably have this effect in the skin less than others. If you're going for a model type face, the idealistic type face, quote unquote, you might want to either not do this effect at all or do it even more subtly than I'm going to do it. But if we come down here to this man, I think this is probably the best showcase of this feeling. Because if we look on the surface, thanks to the dramatic lighting, you can see all these bumps and slight divots all across the surface. And that's what I want to try to achieve. So let me first start doing it, and hopefully then you'll see what I mean by the feeling. To achieve this effect, we're going to use the Skin Wrinkles Big, this texture right here. However, we're going to make it extremely subtle. Let me make sure I'm using the stamp brush, make sure that my scale values are all set to 1. And let me draw a stamp down here on the shoulder where we don't care about it. All right, so this is the texture I want to draw, but much less obvious than this. So let's hit Escape, and I'm going to hit Shift F, and I want to go down to 0.08, maybe 0.07. So extremely subtle, and let's draw that again. Okay, I'm going to draw it out really large. And so this is the kind of texture that I want to overlay basically across the entire sculpture. Now, without the pore detail, it might look a little weird. It's kind of a very subtle leather texture, but watch what happens whenever we add it to the forehead, for example, similar to the way we're looking at this reference. I'm going to click and drag, and you can probably barely even see the effect. But if I speed up the creation process, maybe you'll notice it a bit better. Because it's really not something you want to see plainly. You want it to contribute to the feeling, but not really be something that you can pinpoint exactly. I should have done this with symmetry enabled. But now if we look at the forehead, can you see that subtle bumpiness all across the surface? It really helps this to feel like tissue and not a smooth, hard object with skin details stamped into it. And I really want to add this across the entire head. Keeping the scale very big, but it's okay that it's randomized. That's only going to help the effect. I'm just slowly going to draw these all across the surface. And since it's so subtle, I don't really have to worry about it being noticeable around the horizon of symmetry. Of course, if that concerns you, you can definitely turn off symmetry and go over that area asymmetrically. That's never a bad idea. But it's really going to help the nose, this effect, because the nose feels, I don't know, kind of plastic. That's what I'm fighting against, this plastic sculpture feel. It is a major detriment for your final render if it doesn't have this tissue-like softness. And the stronger this effect, kind of the rougher the complexion of the person. There are definitely people with smoother complexions versus rougher complexions. And for our person here, I'm trying to go for a middle ground. But I think this kind of tissue softness makes it more realistic rather than the idealized skin, so to speak. You know, without this effect, the skin can look kind of like an airbrushed magazine, which might be what you need, you know, depending on what you're sculpting a head for. But for realism, I don't think ideal is the right way to go. All right, let's zoom out and see if we get a better feel. As we rotate around the head, you can just see these subtle bumps, hopefully. If you can't see them, you should feel them. So I'm going to speed up the footage here just so that we can finish the whole head a little bit quicker. Also on the bottom of the nose, looks like I forgot some poor texture detail. Let's go ahead and switch to our skin pores, make our strength back to like 0.2. Go ahead and add those. I think we can make them more subtle than that. This area of the nose tends to be a little smoother. I'm not too worried about the inside of the nostril. All that's going to be in shadow anyway. All right, back to our wrinkle texture and back to the point, what was it, 0.08 about? And yeah, drawing this large on the surface is just going to add a wonderful organic layer. And if this is your first time, you might want to save your scene before you start this pass, because you'll know if you go too strong with this texture, the face won't feel realistic anymore. Again, you don't want to see this texture plainly. You want it to be subtle enough to affect your perception of the surface, but not actually notice it with your eye. I'm going to increase the strength slightly to like 0.1 for the neck area. We do want the effect there too. That's going to help soften it significantly. And there's not a lot of pressure to connect in between all the spaces. You know, some areas I'm missing and I'm okay with that. Okay, right there is an example of where it's too strong. I can notice the effect plain with my eye, right? You can see basically a crease. So let's undo that and go back down to 0.85. You can still see the effect a little bit. I think I need some pore texture detail to fill in that hole. But all the way around the back, it's just going to soften this texture overall. I'm sure by this point I've said the word soften like 100 times, and you're probably saying to yourself, I get it, I get it. But as a teacher, I tend to overcompensate, assuming someone does not see it. But hopefully now that we've addressed the entire head, as I rotate around, you get the feel for that softness. Now, I think I had symmetry disabled when I did the temple area, so I need to add it here. Also, don't be afraid to crisscross the pattern, you know, adding it about in the same place, but just changing the orientation of your stamp. That is totally fine. Okay, I think that's feeling pretty good. Though making sure I got the crow's feet area. At this point, you should be able to notice our surface feels much softer, more like the reference over here. And then that brings us to the second layer I want to add, and that is imperfections. Also in this image, you can see that there's kind of a pothole right here, a divot in the skin right next to a bump. Then there's a little bump, a freckle, a mole, colorless bumps, some possible acne over here. But towards the upper part of his head, there's a lot of just generic subtle bumps. And so this is another place where we can control the complexion of our person. Someone with extremely smooth complexion will not have a lot of these imperfections. Again, the so-called idealized model face will not have a lot of these imperfections, or rather, they've been removed by Photoshop. But a realistic face is going to have some level of these imperfections. So you can add a lot for bad complexion, but I recommend adding a little bit for realism. And I have a new stamp for this. So let's go to our texture settings. And I will duplicate the texture. And I'll call it Skin Bumps. And then go grab that image. And let's load it up, take a look at it. Okay, so this is mostly a black texture with a few random white spots of varying sizes. So you can imagine that this is going to be great for adding these kind of bumps. And so in our brush, let's do a test. I kind of like the idea of adding the test over here on the side. Okay, so it's way too subtle at 0.08. I think let's go back to our safe zone, 0.2. See what that looks like. Okay, so here we have control to add these bumps either stronger or softer or larger, smaller. We're going to utilize all of those different styles. All right, so let's start in the forehead like our reference shows. And I recommend being careful about symmetry when using this stamp, because bumps like this can be a little more noticeable if they're repeated. But for the extreme sides of the head, we should be fine using symmetry. So with that enabled, I'm going to draw some bumps here at the top. Okay. Overall, pretty subtle, but it's important to change the direction with which you are drawing out the pattern. All right, so we'll make some of them push out, and then I'll hold Control and make some push in. All right, I think that might have been a little strong. Let's try it again, not draw it out quite so long. Always remembering to change the direction with which I drag out. Okay, so that little patch there, the bumps add much more believability, and I want to add this everywhere. The main thing to keep in mind is that not all areas should have the exact same concentration of bumps. I think some bumps and potholes should be all over the face, but I think the forehead should have more than the eyelids, for example, or the lips, which really shouldn't have any bumps. But the muzzle, let's say, should have fewer bumps than the sides of the cheeks, right? Because people have acne that leaves holes or slight scars oftentimes. And so adding some subtle potholes, some subtle bumps really goes a long way. Now, I do want to keep in mind that I am symmetrizing this effect. So the closer I get to the center, the more careful I want to be. We can also scale out this texture. If we go to our brush settings, tool settings, if we scale it down in X, like 0.5, it becomes kind of like a small scar. So holding Control, you can see what that does. Now, a lot of people have these subtle little scars on their faces rather than like a fantasy character with a big, war wound scar. But these subtle things are often several places, or even pushing them outward as bumps. Okay, you can kind of see how the symmetry is working against us. So I got too close to the horizon of symmetry there. Let's see if we have that problem elsewhere. I don't think so. Well, honestly, yeah, you can kind of see on both corners of the head or the corner of the zygomatic arch that scar. So I think for this, let's turn off symmetry at this point. We've gotten as much as we can out of it. There we go. Subtle little scar. But yeah, you can definitely stretch out this stamp and get a unique effect. Oftentimes you see potholes and bumps on the chin. So let's go back to our regularly scaled value. And don't forget that we can add them pretty large. The larger they become, they start to look like a mole. And that is definitely not uncommon in the face. I'm trying to think if that one's stronger than I want it to be. Let me undo that, take down the strength to like 0.15 and try that again. There we go. Now we've got larger bumps, but still fairly subtle. Do the same thing to the other side. Let's try on the cheek. There we go. Go back up to our 0.2 range. And I can add these in the eyelid, but I don't want to do that too much. I want to be cautious around the eyes and around the mouth, but the nose definitely has some bumps typically. I'm going to keep them a little bit smaller. Maybe do one that's bigger. And zoom out periodically and get a feel for the overall quality. And yeah, this pass of imperfections I think is going to be a big help to the realism, also contributing to the relatability of the skin. All right, we'll continue down into the neck as well. The neck is also a good place for the stretched version. So let's stretch in X to 0.5 again, or not so much. Let's go to 0.7 if we don't want it to be quite so stretched. Add in pop marks and divots and bump outs. And sometimes I forget to change the direction whenever I pull out the anchored stroke. So you want to be mindful of that as well. If you pull it out the same direction all the time, it's possible that that's noticeable. So I will restore my default scale values. Let's take down the strength. I think I'm definitely doing more bump outs than bump ins. And I think at this point we've done a pretty good job. Let's see, I'm gonna add a few more bumps towards the kind of outskirts of the face, approaching the ear. I'm gonna keep them fairly small. But let's see, as I approach the jawline, let's see, where is this picture? Yeah, the jawline. Another thing to keep in mind about males is that where facial hair grows, there's often a layer of subtle bumps like this. So it might be beneficial to add a bunch of bumps, though subtle, all along the 5 o'clock shadow region. All right, so I'm going to try and do this fairly quickly. Though even after like 30 clicks, it's not terribly obvious. I wonder if we can use an existing texture to make that a little bit easier. Let's go to our texture. Let's try the skin pores and hold control. Yeah, that's probably what I should do. That makes the bumpy 5 o'clock shadow area a little more obvious. And you want to be subtle with this. It can get away from you and be too strong, and Blender's subsurface shader can make this look like acne. So you definitely want to be somewhat subtle here, but it is realistic for it to be there. All right. And let's zoom out, kind of see the broad picture. And I think this looks pretty good. I think this looks like a relatable level of soft tissue feeling on the surface, while also incorporating imperfections that raises our level of realism and believability. Though I don't think we're quite done with the generic skin. I want to come back and do a pass of wrinkles eventually, but this is the second of 3 layers, I suppose, and it's shaping up quite nicely. But in the next lesson, we'll focus our attention to the ears.